Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm here with Lynn Vaccaro. We're members of the Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us for today's webinar titled Estimating Long-Term Phosphorus Retention Capacity of Riverine and Coastal Wetlands. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the NERRS Science Collaborative. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System, or NERRS, is a network of 29 unique research reserves as shown on this map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. Each reserve site includes programs focused on land stewardship, research, and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. The NERRS Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the reserve system. In addition to providing grants, we also work to promote the research and engagement happening across the reserve system through webinars like today's. All attendees were muted upon entry, and we will be handling questions via the question feature in the GoToWebinar console. We'll have time for questions throughout the webinar. However, we encourage you to submit your questions as they occur to you throughout the webinar as well by entering them into the questions field on the console. Before we get started with the formal presentation, we have a few quick polls that we would like to conduct as we look at our audience. You could just respond when you see the poll at your screen. Interesting results. There's a lot of interest in the capacity estimates, retention capacity estimates, I should say, excuse me. Okay, we have one more quick poll before we hand it over to our presenters. Looks like a lot of people in the first two categories, researchers and practitioners. Excellent. Okay, so I'll give a quick introduction to our speakers today. We're lucky to have three members of the research team here with us today, each of whom brought different expertise to the project. I'll briefly introduce each of them. Christy Arend is the research coordinator at Olentangy Creek Reserve. As project lead for the Science Collaborative project, Christy coordinated the research team, helped analyze a long-term record of TP flowing into and out of her reserve's wetlands, and led the development of monitoring protocols. Emily Kuzmic is the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Olentangy Creek Reserve. Emily will not be speaking today because she has no voice, but she is here in spirit and is, I'm sure, excited as we are for the presentation. Sung Chen is an associate professor in University of Toledo's Department of Environmental Sciences. As technical lead for this project, Sung led the statistical analyses of wetland datasets, assisted in creating the monitoring guidelines and protocol, and recruited and supervised students. Christy, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you now.
Great, thanks. Let's see if we can get control. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us today. What we were going to talk about is first just kind of provide the context for our project, which really is based in harmful algal blooms, the problem of harmful algal blooms, and what role wetlands can play in intercepting nutrients that fuel those blooms. We'll go into how we address that from a technical perspective, so the data analysis we did, as well as how we worked collaboratively with a group of practitioners to address this issue. Then move on to the results and how we communicated those results, some of the different types of communication pieces that we've produced. And then finally finish by talking about, now that this project is over, how we envision moving forward with the group of people that we've been working with. So first, I just want to start with kind of providing the context for the study. So obviously, harmful algal blooms are a global problem, and we can see that in the United States, at least the continental United States, that it occurs across the country in all of the states. This is just a graph showing news reports of algal blooms from 2010 to present. So you can see our freshwaters and our coastal waters all are impacted by this problem. We're working in Ohio, so we were addressing the problem more specifically here. So if we zoom into Ohio, you can see a number of different dots. The ones on the map that I have circled in orange really are showing kind of the hotspot areas or locations where we have chronic problems, where every year these blooms occur and raise concerns about public health, recreational, swimming and boating, as well as the economic impacts that can have. And so you can see just to the right of Columbus, this is just a small recreational reservoir. Grand Lake St. Mary's is shown on the western part of the state. We'll show some data from that today. It's a larger reservoir. And then the western basin of Lake Erie, which is where we'll be focusing most of our talk. And so you can see on the right here, this picture of Lake Erie. This was taken in 2011. You can see a pretty extensive algal bloom. And in fact, this year, the toxin concentrations were 50 times the World Health Organization's safe body contact limit, and were 1,200 times the limit for safe drinking water. So the concentrations were quite high, and it was very concerning. In 2014, Toledo, the city of Toledo, ended up having to close its drinking water plant due to the toxins in the water, and that affected 500,000 people. So definitely a big problem and a big challenge for the watersheds in the states surrounding Lake Erie. And so the United States and Canada have had this Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement since 1972, and it was updated in 2016 to include new phosphorus loading reduction targets to the western basin of Lake Erie in particular watersheds. So the map down here shows different watersheds within the larger Lake Erie basin, and the ones that are colored have been identified as priority watersheds for reducing phosphorus loading to the lake. And basically the target is to reduce overall loading by 40% in terms of total phosphorus, and then reducing total phosphorus, soluble reactive phosphorus in the target watersheds also by 40%. And this was all based on a 2008 baseline, because that was a year where loading seemed to be an average level that produced a fairly mild bloom. So trying to keep that bloom under control. This area of Lake Erie also happens to be where historically there was a huge number of, a large area of coastal wetlands. So in this map, all of the blue area represent coastal wetlands. And this concentration in the western part of the map is known as the Great Black Swamp. That also happened to be very fertile soil. And so in this next map showing what it looked like in the year 2000, you can see that the vast majority, over 95% of those wetlands, were converted largely to agriculture, but also to other development as well. So we've lost, well over 95% of our wetlands in the western basin, which is right where the majority of nutrients are coming into the lake. Apparently, people understand the role of wetlands and the fact that they act as filters, natural filters, because they kind of put two and two together. And right around this time, like in 2014, we started seeing a lot of editorials and other articles really calling for the restoration of wetlands to help meet the 40% loading reduction targets, and to try to help, in addition to agricultural practices, to try to help reduce these algal blooms. And so around that time as well, we received a call from one of our partners at the Ohio Lake Erie office for the Nature Conservancy. And what she was interested in doing was really being able to quantify, put a quantitative number to what their wetlands that they manage and restore were doing in terms of water quality. And so she was wondering how we could use the long-term water quality monitoring data that we collect at Old Moon Creek and that people have analyzed over the years, how we could use that information to try to say how much we would think that some of the other wetlands along the coast of Lake Erie are contributing to nutrient reduction. So the picture on the left shows a diked wetland. A number of the wetlands that do remain along the coast are diked and managed largely for waterfowl. The picture on the right actually shows a constructed wetland along Grand Lake St. Mary's, specifically constructed for water quality improvement as part of a treatment train. So we wanted to know how we could expand our information or apply our information from Old Moon Creek to these other types of wetlands. And so that brought about this project then, where the objective was really to quantify this ecosystem service of how wetlands improve water quality, with specific questions of how much phosphorus can wetlands retain, and then how does retention differ among different types of wetlands. And we wanted to do this to generate realistic expectations as to how much we should expect wetlands to contribute to this overall goal of reducing nutrients. We didn't want people to think of wetlands as a silver bullet. We wanted to be realistic in thinking how much they could contribute to the larger effort. And then we kind of had our own question as well. We wanted to know how willing wetland managers would be to prioritize water quality over other services that they also manage for. And so just from working with some of our partners and interviewing them, we had this general understanding that for the most part, a lot of the coastal, at least the coastal wetlands along Lake Erie, are really managed for native habitat and for recreation purposes, and much less for water quality. And so, again, we wanted to be realistic in terms of our expectations in, thinking about how feasible it would be to shift these management and restoration priorities from habitat and recreation toward prioritizing water quality a little bit more. So I'm going to pass it over to Sung, and he'll talk about how we did this from a quantitative perspective, and then I'll talk about how we worked with the group collaboratively to address this as well.
Okay, thanks. The concept of nutrient retention in the wetland, especially phosphorus, started a long time ago in the 1980s. We sort of already understood most of the mechanisms controlling phosphorus retention. If you look at this plot, this figure, phosphorus gets into a wetland, will be absorbed by microbials and algae and settled into the sediment. And part of the phosphorus gets into the sediment will be absorbed by plants. And because phosphorus only has two states, either dissolved in water or attached to solids. So the mechanism is very simple, straightforward. Either it's in the water or in the sediment. And if it's absorbed by plants or algae, these biological materials will die quickly. And once they get decomposed by microbials, the phosphorus stored in them will be released into the water column. So if we look at this this big picture, you can divide this phosphorus retention capacity into short-term and a long-term. And short-term are those biological components, algae, microbials, and plants. And the long-term are the solid phase of mostly sediment buildup and burial. If you think about this as cups and buckets, things coming in, first stored in the cups, and the cups will be quickly saturated and spilled over to the buckets. And if your loading is not, if the wetland is not overwhelmed, meaning the loading the amount of phosphorus loaded into the wetland is below the long-term capacity, the capacity of retaining phosphorus in the sediment, then you will see most of the phosphorus inputted into the wetland will be stored within the wetland. Therefore, the phosphorus concentration leaving the wetland in the water column will be low and relatively stable. Once you overload the storage capacity, then the surplus portion of the phosphorus sooner or later will be reflected in the water column, and you'll start to see the concentration of phosphorus leaving the wetland gradually increasing as as the loading rate increases. And because of that conceptual model, we built this into a mathematical change point model. It's really just two lines. If you put the phosphorus loading rate on the x-axis and the concentration leaving the wetland on the y-axis, and what we expect to see is the concentration stays relatively stable until you pass a threshold, loading threshold, and then concentration starts to increase. And by parameterize that into a statistical model, we can actually estimate what's the expected concentration if you don't overload the wetland, how fast the concentration increases once you pass the loading rate, and what is the threshold, or the statistically we call that change point. So that's a change point model because it looks like hockey stick. So many people also call this kind of model a hockey stick model. And to fit the hockey stick model, we need long-term data because the retention capacity is a long-term capacity. We need data, and the Olentangy Creek estuary has such data. So we have monitoring sites at inflow and outflow. And for 2015, we have daily data. So now for the inflow, we calculated a 5-day running average of inflow loading and the pair with each days of the concentration leaving the wetland. So each day's concentration represents is paired by the average loading for the previous 5 days, and that's roughly the travel time or residence time of the wetland. And because we have this daily data, we have a wide range of loading. So if you remember, to fit the model, we need to have high and low loadings to capture the threshold. All right, and the other wetlands we have in our study have very limited data. So how do we sort of leverage in a wetland system with large amount of data to help the wetlands with very limited data set? And the technical approach is what we call a Bayesian hierarchical modeling. So if you think about that hockey stick model or change point model, in the model we have 4 parameters. And if we fit the model with each individual wetlands, those parameters could be highly variable depending on how much data you have. But when you have a hierarchical modeling approach, you put all these wetlands together, and the overall average of these parameters from different wetlands serves as an anchor, just like here. Anchor. Once you have an anchor, you sort of constrain the parameter to not to be too big or too small. And this is a class of mathematical estimator, statistical estimator. People call that shrinkage estimator. And this is something we started to know since the 1960s. And sort of in the statistical field, if you hear people say it's a shrinkage estimator, that means it's more stable and it's more accurate.
All right, I think, did we want to check if there are any questions at this point with the statistical approach?
There haven't been any questions typed in yet.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
You
we
can
will
keep going.
move forward then. Okay,
Okay.
great. So then we had this kind of more qualitative side of the project, this more collaborative approach to addressing this issue as well. And so we had two different groups that we worked with, a project team as well as a collaborative learning group. And our project team was a much smaller, more focused group of technical and non-technical end users who were interested in the results and the implications. And we met with them every 2 to 3 months, and they included representatives from a couple different universities, and as well as some government and non-governmental agencies and organizations that you can see here. Our collaborative learning group was much larger. We had over 20 different individuals that represented a variety of wetland practitioners and decision makers, again, coming from the academic world, coming from government agencies, non-governmental organizations, as well as private hunt clubs and conservancies. And we met quarterly with this group. And what we did with this group is a number of different things. Throughout the project, we would review our technical progress in terms of what data we were analyzing and the results that we were finding to date. And then we really leaned heavily on this group to help us develop our non-technical communication product. So how were we going to get this information out to non-scientists? So they helped us identify the content that we wanted to include, who our target audience would be, the formats or the types of products that we wanted to produce, and how we wanted to apply or distribute them around. And we'll show you what we ended up with in a little bit. And then also, if we think back to that third question that we were interested in terms of management priorities, we discussed with this group a lot of, we discussed with them what their management priorities were, what their practices were, and what they saw as being barriers or opportunities to starting to prioritize water quality as an ecosystem service, in addition to the other ecosystem services that they were already managing for. So we used a number of different strategies in these meetings. We did live polling, roving flip charts, some prioritization exercises, identified gaps and barriers, like I just mentioned, had some impact versus effort tables to sort of help with prioritization, and then also had some pre-project and post-project surveys that they completed. So for example, at the beginning of the project, we asked them what their top management considerations were. And even though we saw earlier that a number of them are managing more for habitat and recreation, water quality still came up as a very important consideration for management. And I think some of that was because of the fact that we have these major water quality issues in Lake Erie right now. The other thing that we did with this group is we ended up holding our meetings at different members' sites so that we could incorporate site visits into our meetings. And so this provided an opportunity for our different learning group members to really network with each other and learn from each other about how they were managing their wetlands. And it also gave us something to look forward to at the end of sitting down for half a day in meetings. So it was really nice to kind of get up, walk around, and see these different sites. So what did we find? I'm going to pass it over to Song again. He'll provide you an overview of what we found in terms of the quantitative side of the project.
Okay, so we have data. Yes.
I was just going to say, there was a question that came in, Song, that relates to, I think, your method. Do you want to entertain that now?
Sure, yeah.
So the question is about your modeling and how you combined, and I guess, did you combine data from the data-limited wetlands and the data-rich wetlands? Did you combine those to do your modeling?
Yes, I will answer that question while I'm talking about the results. Okay. So the Bayesian hierarchical model, ideally, if we have a lot of wetlands together, then we can combine those wetlands, and those wetlands are treated as separate wetlands, but they are also related, meaning we are modeling them using the same model, but the model coefficients are different, are sort of wetland specific. And the hierarchical model essentially provides a framework to link them together. And because when we started, we only have a large enough data set from Olentangy Creek. And for the Olentangy Creek, if I just use this data set, and I can estimate what is the, so this data set shows you that typical hockey stick model type of fashion, and I can estimate what is the threshold. So less than 4,000 pounds a year for this wetland. Well, and then we break this data set because we have a lot of data points here. We break this data set into 4 seasons. And each season, the loading rate is different, and then the wetland behaves a little bit different. So we actually see the variation of the change point by season. And we use that as a sort of a starting point for this, for estimating this, we call it anchor. So that, and then we apply that to other wetlands. Now, some of the wetlands are very difficult to use. This is an example, Crane Creek. Crane Creek, it has only one opening. So the water flows in and out through the same control system, and it's all controlled by lake water level Sashi events. So this one, we have difficulty to pair the inflow loading and outflow concentration, so we didn't really use it. There's another one, Coldwater Creek. It's a riverine system, and you can see the inflow from here to one point and outflow to point, and water is controlled in all these different cells, so it's covered that. And when we fit this model, we use the Olentangy Creek data as using the Bayesian terminologies as a prior, and then update this. And if you're interested in see how we get to this particular model, we have the model posted in the GitHub page. If we have time at the end, I will show you how to run that model. And another wetland also the constructed wetland. There are 2 different cells at this is the Olentangy River experimental wetland. There are two cells created along Olentangy River, and water is piped in one direction and going there. But this wetland, when they monitored one of the cells, we didn't see a typical hockey stick pattern. It seems like the wetland is always consistently overload. But with the Bayesian prior, we sort of forced the data into that particular hockey model structure. We were able to get some estimate, and that tentative estimate can be used later on to analyze their later data when they have some low loading rate data points. And some of the data points you see at the edge, those are the data points, the concentration measurements without a loading associated with them. It's just missing. And putting them all together, you'll see there are different estimates. All the wetlands behave very differently. And in this case, we did not normalize the retention threshold by the size of the wetland, largely because Olentangy Creek, the size of the wetland is determined by the water level. The higher the water level, the larger the size, and large flow probably shortcut the flow. Anyway, so that's that. Well, based on our analysis, we say not all wetlands are suitable for this particular type of model. If we cannot reasonably pair the input to output, then it's difficult to do. And then stormwater treatment wetlands, if the wetland is mostly dry and only get input during the rainy season, and that will not be able to, I mean, we just cannot have a consistent sort of pairing of input to output. And then the input data, the loading condition has to have a wide range, because otherwise, if the data doesn't capture the loading threshold, the model cannot estimate that. And we are preparing a manuscript to describe the model and describe the technical aspect of that. And the code of our work is posted on GitHub at this location. And as I said, when we have it, we'll actually show it. And as part of the code in there, there's a folder called example that shows we can upload this model into the cloud, here specifically the Google Drive, and then you can simply run the model with your data uploaded to Google Drive. You don't have to install all the statistical softwares just to use Google's infrastructure.
And then we also developed a monitoring protocol to go along with that. So basically the idea was, is there a way that we can have this model accessible and useful to practitioners who might want to do this type of analysis for their own data? You might have noticed we had data sets not just from the coast of Lake Erie, but we also had to go to Grand Lake, St. Mary's, as well as the Columbus area, because it's really hard to find good monitoring data for wetlands, particularly in this area. So we were hoping to kind of encourage that by providing this monitoring protocol and then this interface where the user doesn't have to understand the statistics or know how to code in R.
That's right.
To be able to sort of input their data and run the model. So both of those are available. We're still kind of tweaking the model interface. It's still a work in progress, but so were there have any questions popped up about the technical results?
Yeah, no additional questions at this moment, but folks should type them in as they come.
All right, great. So in terms of our non-technical projects, then again, we worked closely with the collaborative learning group to develop these. The first one is it's kind of a hybrid between an infographic and a fact sheet. So we ended up ended up deciding not to really target a particular audience, but to try to make these non-technical communication products accessible to a variety of people with different levels of interest and understanding of the science behind what we did. So the front of the infographic really is just kind of more picture-based, trying to limit the number of words, really going into kind of what the problem is with phosphorus and harmful algal blooms, and then how wetlands can play a role in taking up and retaining some of that phosphorus, but again, trying to communicate that they do have a limit to their capacity. The back of it is more of a fact sheet type level of information that really goes a little more into the details of the project for people who are interested in that. And then we have a link for our other non-technical product, which is a story map that's available online. And with the story map, this again kind of allows for general public to interact with it and understand it, as well as providing a way for people to dive a little deeper into the study and some of the science behind it. So we start with just an overview of what wetlands are, wetland loss in the Great Lakes region, especially Lake Erie, and the ecosystem services that wetlands provide. We provide an overview of the different types of wetlands and how they're managed for different priorities. We have a section that explains phosphorus loading to Lake Erie and how that fuels the algal blooms. And then we go into the details of the phosphorus capacity study and the results that we found. So that's available at this link if anyone wants to explore that a little bit. So just a couple of quick questions. You guys haven't had much time to process these things, but just some quick questions in terms of would this modeling approach be something that any of you could see employing for your own wetlands, either for research or for management? You're not sure, or this isn't really something that fits your need or your stakeholders' needs, or it's just not something you would have the data available to do. Right, that's actually pretty good. Very promising, great. Well, makes the effort for the GitHub all worth it. All right. And then our next question is more about the communication products. Could any of you see using these to communicate this concept and the results to any of your stakeholders or community members? The infographic as it is, or maybe modified for different regions, since it's very Lake Erie specific. The story map, both of them or neither. And I know you haven't had much of a chance to look at either of those products, but just kind of thinking about them more generally. All right, great. Yeah. If you were interested in modifying it, we could probably work with you on that. So feel free to get in touch. All right. So just to wrap it up then, we wanted to talk a little bit about where we see ourselves and our partners moving forward with this concept and this idea of how wetlands might be able to contribute to improving water quality in Lake Erie. So it just so happened that as our project was wrapping up, the governor of Ohio was releasing his H2 Ohio initiative, which is basically a new initiative to improve Ohio's water quality throughout the state. And it's really focused on reducing phosphorus loading to our water bodies through an increase in agricultural conservation practices, as well as through wetland restoration and enhancement, with an initial focus on the Lake Erie Basin. So where our connection is really thinking about the wetland restoration and enhancement along coastal Lake Erie, but also up in the watersheds as well that flow into Lake Erie. And so our projects have been able to, or this project and members of our project have been able to become involved in this initiative right away. We've been able to talk to the administration with the Department of Natural Resources and provide them our data and our results to help them understand that wetlands do have a retention capacity, what our model could do if they wanted to apply it, and what the limitations of our model are, like we described earlier. Old Woman Creek Reserve is actually leading the effort to develop a monitoring program for the projects that are put into place so that we can really have a good sense of how successful these projects are in reducing nutrient loading. And this group that's working on this monitoring protocol also includes some members of our project team, as well as some members of our collaborative learning group. And then finally, a number of the members of our collaborative learning group are actually going to be involved as managers for some of the restoration and enhancement projects. So it's some of their sites that have been tapped into for some of these projects. So that's pretty exciting that we're able to kind of dive right into this new initiative and contribute at the tail end of our project. So we'd like this to continue even further and kind of be a forum that provides a community for everyone to kind of learn from and each other's practices. So we're also looking to build a community of practice out of this. And to do that, we worked with our collaborative learning group to identify different gaps and opportunities for really understanding more completely the role that wetlands can play in reducing nutrient loading. And so we looked at gaps and opportunities within knowledge. And what came up here was that there was definitely an interest in learning and understanding some more of the mechanisms that underlie nutrient uptake. So for example, how different plant communities might take up nutrients, how the type of sediment or soil in the area influences phosphorus retention. So really much more of a mechanistic understanding. But then on the flip side, one of the barriers or the concerns to actually prioritizing water quality in managing wetlands was how introducing lower quality water to a wetland was going to impact the habitat quality, because many of these wetlands support really good hunting and bird watching opportunities. And so there's concern that if poor water quality is introduced into the wetlands, the habitat quality will go down and they won't be as diverse as they were and support those communities. That was a big concern that came up. We discussed different funding opportunities, both for research and restoration work, and how those could be leveraged to provide opportunities to explore some of these questions. And then also talked about maintaining existing partnerships and building out future partnerships as well. And one thing in kind of the partnership area that kept coming up was that one of the challenges to doing some of this research and monitoring and restoration work was finding willing landowners who were able to turn over some of their agricultural land to wetland restoration. So finding those willing landowners is kind of an issue that we need to figure out how to surmount. So then what we did is we took these gaps and priorities or opportunities that we identified, and we asked the collaborative learning group to rate them based on impact and ability. So is it something that's easy to do and would have a high impact, easy, low impact, difficult to do with a low impact, or difficult to do with a high impact? And we were looking, certainly for this box, and then a little bit into the hard but high box as well. And what they came up with was kind of in order of priority was a greater understanding of water quality's impact on the vegetative community in wetlands, understanding how different plant species take up phosphorus, and then really getting a better feel for the sediment dynamics in wetlands. So those are some areas now that we can move forward with this group in a collaborative way. So moving forward with these partners, obviously we would love to have more people apply the model and the results. The more wetlands that are included into this hierarchical model, the better the estimates for those thresholds are going to be, because there's just that much more data that's contributing to it. In terms of the priority gaps and opportunities that I just discussed, there's definitely interest from our group across the different agencies, academia, and private entities in pursuing some of those. And then obviously I already talked about how we're involved in, many of us are involved in H2 Ohio initiatives. And then again, identifying and pursuing funding sources. So can we find different ways that we can fund this type of work? It's very difficult to find funding for monitoring. I'm sure many of you already know that. And then a lot of the H2 Ohio funds are not really going to fund research. So if there are research questions we're asking, we need to seek funding outside of that. And then finally, just provide this forum that we can continue to share the outcomes of our work and the lessons learned. So we're really hoping that that will move forward and we can continue to work together as a group. And this is just to thank everyone that was involved in the project and the folks in the Science Collaborative who helped along the way quite a bit. And I think we're happy to take additional questions, and we can also run through the example on GitHub if people are interested.
That's great. Thank you, Christy, and thank you, Song. We've actually got quite a few questions here, and I'll just kind of run through them. But I should say that the presenters today have actually agreed to make sure that all the questions get answered in the written document, the written summary that we'll produce at the end of this webinar. And the presenters have also agreed to stay on the line an extra few minutes if there's still interest. So we'll do our best here to get through the questions. So first one here for you two, for folks who are interested in using this approach in a new geography, what should they be aware of?
So specifically, what kind of a new geography we're talking about? In general, we need a data set, data that can be paired input to output. So input loading. Input, we have to be able to calculate the loading. So we have to have input the flow and the concentration. For the output, we only need concentration. And for each output concentration, we would like to pair that with a loading rate. And for most wetland data set I saw, typically people go out once a week, more likely once every other week. And with that kind of data, we typically just aggregate them to a monthly average input and monthly average output. And the example we use here, the smallest data set, we had 8 data points, 8 monthly input and output. And the largest wetland, we have thousands of data points. And as Christy said, the more people use the model, the better we can update the what we call the Bayesian prior model. So that the anchoring point, and the better we have the prior, the better the case-specific results.
So, Song, would you say that someone in another geographic region could use the Olentangy Creek data as their anchor, or would they need to have a full, complete data set that's local to serve as the anchor?
Yeah. This is getting into a little bit more technical part. I sort of standardized the loading. So technically, yes, if you are, let's say, if you're working on the Everglades, this prior should be able to apply, because when the model is running, it's running on the standardized loading rate. So the standardized loading rate. So when I took your loading rate, the loading rate will be subtract from your average and divide by your standard deviation. So all the wetlands should have the same mean, which is 0, and the same variance, which is 1. So the model should work in different places.
And you've actually done this, right, in Florida? Song?
Yeah, that's well this model started from the work I did a long time ago in the Everglades. Yes.
Okay. The person who asked that question was from Vermont, so it sounds like it could be pretty applicable.
That's right.
Along this sort of similar vein is a question about what other parameters do you look at during the field sampling, and then does that help you decide if you can combine and relate different wetlands?
Yes and no. I think the other parameters, we really look at that to justify whether we can use a area, the size, normalize the data or not. So if a wetland is like a constructed wetland, then we know what the effective size of the wetland is. That means what the area of the wetland that's directly contacting with the inflow and outflow. And other than that, I would think now, as I said, combining data from different wetlands, my initial technical concern was that the different wetland will have a different retention capacity. Even if you have exactly the same kind of wetlands, different sizes will have different retention capacity. So the model, when I put it into the computer code, I decided to standardize the loading. So from that perspective, all the wetlands has the enough data points that covers the enough range should be able to combine. And what I have to say, the combine is just a figurative words. We don't really physically combine data from different wetlands. They are still separately treated within the model. And when you have your model, you only have your own data. And this particular setup allows you to use the result from other models as a sort of a starting point. So that's using the other wetland as a starting point. That's the sense of a combine.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, and I think
that's
in terms of, Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say, in terms of other like parameters, the base assumption of the model is that it's the burial, burial through sedimentation over time. So it's really kind of the sedimentation rate that's driving the retention capacity. So understanding that, that kind of sediment dynamics could help in terms of thinking mechanistically about what's going on. But the model doesn't include anything about biological uptake or anything like that. Because again, we're looking at that long-term storage, which is really based on burial.
That's right.
So some of our wetlands, we could probably give, tons per year per acre estimate for, because we do have a good size estimate for those. But for Olentangy Creek, we didn't have that size estimate because it changes size with lake levels.
Okay. And I think that addresses kind of this related question, kind of clarifying the way data from different wetlands are used. I mean, obviously, different wetlands have different loading rates, and so when you try to apply this to a new region, you're going to apply the appropriate loading rate at that site, right?
Right. So this probably we can demonstrate that through that example. In that example we posted on GitHub, there is a process of updating one particular wetland. First, it was used, the 8 data points was fit using Olentangy Creek's data as the starting point. And once we fit that model for 8 data points, we got another batch of data points, and we then update that model. So you'll see the process is that just sort of for each individual wetland, you don't really have to have access to other wetlands to use the hierarchical model.
Okay. And this might actually be a good segue. There's a question about data accessibility. Is this data available to the public? Do you want to just talk a little bit about what you've made available?
All the data we use are on that GitHub site.
Great, so folks can play around with it.
Yeah, maybe we can show you the GitHub site and what's available there.
Do you want to do that right now?
Are we good with questions? If you want to switch us over.
There's definitely some more questions. We could do just kind of a quick sort of snapshot of the tool and then come back to questions. And I think we can give the audience the choice to kind of stick around and hear the full response to the questions, or wait for the summary that'll come out in a few weeks.
All right, so are you able to see our screen now?
We are.
Right.
Okay, so here, this site, I have some of these R codes, and these R codes are the R code I use to process all the data and fit all the model, and also included on the last one here for the project for sample size. So we have another part we didn't talk about, is that have a way to estimate what would be the adequate sample size. So let me show you what that example entails here. If you want to use this example, you can download this particular file called example CWC IPYNB. So IPY is stand for IPython, and NB is notebook. And the next file ends with the .r data. That's the model we use to fit the Olentangy Creek data. And inside the data folder, I have the data set for Coldwater Creek. So the first data set, CWC data, that's the first data file we got. And once we, near the end of the project, we got other two, sort of the next phase of the monitoring data. So if you want to use it, download all these files, data folder, all the data, and this Python notebook file and this R data file into a Google Drive. So here, my drive, and here's a CWC example. And inside here, you have this notebook one, and you have this data file one. And that's all you need. In your Google Drive, opened up in the browser, if you click Open with Google Collaboratory, and if you don't have this option, then you need to say add connect more apps, and that should appear. Now, once you click that, we already have it open. That's fine. So now this is the interface of the notebook, and the notebook here. If you look at this interface here, there's a folder icon, file icon. If you open that up, you'll see folders. Those are the folders on the cloud on the Google site. And before you run this code, you won't see my drive here. So here is the first code line you need to run to connect your drive to Google. If you run this, then these dialog will pop up, and you're prompted with a link, and you click the link, and the link will ask you permission to link your Google Drive to Google. And then once you give the permission, you'll be given a code, and copy and paste the code somewhere here. So can I do this?
I think I'm already.
Yeah. So it's okay. So if you do this, then here they allow, then you'll have a code. So copy the code, and here to run this, just click run. So this is already done. So this is already now. Once it's done, you will see my drive here, and then here's that. And now the next code chunk sets up the system. And this one takes a little bit of time just because you have to install all the necessary the functions and all that into Google Cloud. And the only thing you need to change here is here. The content drive, that's the Google Cloud, and the My Drive, that's your Google Drive. And then you have to specify where you have all the data. And in this case, we put it in CWC example. And that's that. Okay. So with that, if you run this through, and there's nothing to worry about this part. It's mostly setting things up. And then the next up, we import the data. So now here, if I run it, the data import dialog comes up, and we in the last line of the code, we have some plots, and here are the plots. And this part, because of the specific format of the data, we calculate we have to go in there, read the data, and then calculate the loading, and then convert the loading to tons per year, because the flow was inputted in gallons per minute, and concentration is milligrams per liter. So you multiply that together, and that's the data prep process. And once you have the data, so now the next up is the updated, the new data. New data, we have a little bit more data points here. And once the data is loaded, now we need to run the model. First of all, I have a function to sort of take the result from other model runs, and that's the function to use, and convert it to a prior. And here, this STAM model 3, that's the entire hierarchical model. And this hierarchical model, if you run this, it just takes the model into the computer memory. And this one is a function in R that processes the data to create input data. If we run it, it's in there. And now here it is. When so we have this prior information, we run that, and we filter the data by filtering out all the flow equals zeros, and then run through this function processing the input data set. And the processing the input data set, I calculate what is the mean of the input loading, what is the standard deviation of the input loading, so that way we can standardize the input. So here, run this, it calculates it. It loads the previous data, calculates the input data set. And next up, we fit the model. And fitting the Bayesian model, we use a Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation method, and that's the software called a STAN. And so we run that through R, and if we run it, this one takes a little bit of time, right? So we need to first compile the model into C code, and then run the Monte Carlo simulation second step. And once we finished, we process an output. The output, see here, we're converting back the threshold and all that to the original scale using the means and the standard deviation. So to unstandardize it. So shall we click it?
We can click it. We can answer some questions while
Yeah.
it's running.
Okay.
So we could answer some questions while this is running if you want.
Sure, that sounds great.
And
then all of this will be recorded. Really nice.
Normally, you won't see this save failed thing. Everything you do will be automatically saved, even the results, into your Google Drive. And here is probably because the state computer line prevents us from uploading things to Google Drive.
Yeah. Okay. It's still super neat to get to see in detail
it's
like
still
this.
Running.
Okay. So I got a couple questions here that are maybe more about the results and some of the findings and patterns you've observed. So a question about created wetlands. You know, in Ohio, there's an effort to create wetlands. Do you expect that created wetlands will have more or less capacity? And so do your findings, you know, can they help answer that?
So since we couldn't put everything in a per area basis for comparison, it was a little harder to do. Two of our wetlands were created, so the Olentangy wetlands were created as well as the Coldwater Creek.
Yeah.
And there were differences that probably were largely size-based on those.
Yeah.
From talking to the person that manages the Coldwater Creek wetland, what he's also found is they have one cell that traps sediment, and so he will notice over time that its ability to retain phosphorus starts to decrease as that particular wetland cell becomes full with the sediment, and so he's able to go in, dredge that sediment out, and then reset that capacity. And I think that's kind of what happens at Oldman Creek, because we get flushed out every year with high river discharge. And so I think it might be more a function of how sediment is accumulating and removing that sediment to kind of reset it, or at least, you know, how much more sediment can accumulate over time, from thinking about that being the main mechanism, as opposed to whether it's created or not. I think it has to do with the sediment dynamics, and that's one reason why we'd be interested in studying that a little bit more.
That's right. So in the Everglades, when I did my work, it was on the natural wetland. And then the state of Florida created some wetlands, restored wetlands from sugarcane fields. I used the model to estimate what's the capacity, and they used monitoring data to calculate how much phosphorus was retained in the wetland. And we came up with exactly the same number. So it doesn't
seem to matter.
Doesn't seem to matter whether it's created or natural. And I think the mechanism is phosphorus attached to the sediment. If the sediment is mineral soil, it has more absorption capacity, and I guess in Florida, the sediment buildup is faster.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Anyway, so the model finished running. And once the model finished running, we just need to process the output data. And in here, I have some examples processing the output data. So the output data, first of all, is extracted from the Monte Carlo simulation. And then I have a few lines of code to plot the output. So this is 8 data points. And you'll see the final result is not very refined in a sense. We have a high confidence range. And now, this particular model, we're using this particular model as a prior now. So this is our fitted model from last step. So the last step here. This is the model we just fit. And we have a new input data set. So if I run this, you'll see what happens with the, so I combine all the data process and model run and result in the same what they call cell, notebook cell. It shouldn't be very long. This one, we don't have, this one probably 20 some data points.
You want another question while we wait?
Sure.
Oh, there we go. Every time you go for the question, it's
So this is the updated model look like.
So yeah, so that's kind of how it works, and that's once we have it where people can input their own data.
So I'm going to add a sort of what do you call that? Template data file. If you just follow the template, then I will change the code into that particular template, so that whenever you have new data, put it in that template and upload. You take the code, you can actually run it.
All right.
Very cool.
So if we have other questions, we can move on to those.
Okay. Yeah, let's do that. So here's a question about seasonal patterns. Did you notice any difference in uptake seasonally?
So yeah.
We do have differences in estimated seasonal retention capacity in Olentangy Creek, but I'm not sure how meaningful that is. Simply because if you bury a lot of sort of dead plant material near the end of summer, these dead plant material will gradually decompose, and some of the nutrients will be released back to water column later. So from a long-term perspective, seasonal pattern may or may not be that relevant, I would say.
Yeah, so when we looked at the seasonal patterns, they seem to reflect more of what was going on in the short-term storage department, where you would see a lot of, like, the retention capacity would basically increase in the late spring through late summer, early fall, when you have all the plants there, all the microbes cranking, and you have a lot of biological processing. And then that retention capacity would decrease in the winter when you don't have as much biological activity. So that really, those differences really seem to reflect the short term as opposed to the long term dynamics. And this model is really created to look at long term.
Long term, yeah.
Okay. So here's a question from somebody who I think is thinking about urban areas where there's limited opportunities to create and restore wetlands. do you think there's a minimum size of wetlands that can retain significant amounts of phosphorus?
That's a question that the head of the Department of Natural Resources keeps asking us, and that's really where I think we would need more data that show that are per area as opposed to what we have, which is just per year. So if we could get more per area data, I think that would be helpful.
We get data from more of the constructed wetlands.
More of the constructed wetlands, yeah.
We know their size.
I think in urban areas, the challenge is that sometimes that's going to be a lot flashier, and you're going to have mostly high loading events, and you're not going to have as much of those lower loading events. And so finding out where that threshold is going to be difficult because you're limited. So we did try to actually analyze data for some stormwater wetlands in North Carolina, and they were always very far. They were either being overloaded or not receiving water at all.
Yeah.
And so with an urban system, you know, if you can keep water in it and you have these low loading events as well as high loading events, you can look at that threshold, you can calculate where that threshold is, and then I think you can start to see, are you typically overloading it more than not? And that would suggest that the wetland's too small. You know, so I think you can glean some of that from this, but unfortunately we just don't have enough data looking at per area what these wetlands are doing.
Okay. Makes sense. So I got a question here, which unfortunately I think relates to the graph that we just took off the screen. Someone's asking the plot that we were just looking at, is there an equation that goes with that to describe the line, I assume?
So that's the two lines, the hockey stick model. Okay, yeah, there is. And let me see, maybe in our GitHub page we have that described, but.
And we're not looking at your page anymore, Song, so maybe
okay.
You could
answer well, more generally, it's just the two straight lines. The first segment of the line is flat, and then second segment has a positive slope. And those two line segments meet at the threshold. So you can write it in a single equation, or write it as two separate equations and constrain them to be sort of intersect at one particular place. And this particular equation used to be really difficult to deal with. And when I first did it, we had to write a whole paper to talk about how to deal with it. But now the computational tools are different. It's very simple, straightforward to do it.
And is that part of the output that is produced with your tool?
Yeah. So the model is parameterized by 4 parameters, and the model will export those 4 parameters. And in our GitHub, there's a data processing R code and a hockey stick model R code, and in that hockey stick model part, there's a description of the code in there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's perfect. Thank you. So here's another kind of more technical question again about that hockey stick model. So given current land use practices, is it realistic to expect that future data points in which nutrients are being retained in the wetland will build out observations along the hockey stick and therefore reduce the uncertainties for the Old Woman Creek or for the non-Old Woman Creek wetlands? And does that question make sense? If not, it could be one that we could handle in the summary to give you a little more time to think about it.
Yeah, I think it will be better if I think about it more. I mean, in theory, these as long as the basic mechanism doesn't change,
right,
the model should work.
And as long as as monitoring happens during low flow conditions and low loading conditions, as well as high loading conditions, because really you want to build out data on both sides of that threshold. So, you know, I don't know if putting in place agricultural conservation practices will, you know, it might reduce the loading and you might not see those high loading data points anymore. You might see more low loading data points, which would be awesome. Because then you're showing that you're falling more within that wetlands long-term retention capacity. So I think you always want a wide range of data points if you can get them with loadings. You don't want to be heavy on one end or the other, because that's going to make it harder to find that change point. Yeah.
Right. You can see the full hockey stick shape. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's two final questions here, both about invasive species. How does the presence of large invasive plants like cattails and phragmites affect the thresholds? And if you're not sure, the question answer is asking you to just guess, not guess, but make your best judgment.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends if that impacts the long-term storage, the sedimentation.
So I'm just guessing. If the invasive plant species actually increase the buildup of sediment because they grow more or something like that, which may help sort of bury more phosphorus.
Yeah, so that again, that hits on some of those more mechanistic questions that our collaborative learning group raised that are ripe for future study.
Yep. And you've been documenting all of those too, so that's great.
Yeah.
And I think this will be our last question here. Have you seen an increase in wetland invasive plants that you can associate with elevated nutrient availability?
That's really beyond the scope of what.
Yeah.
But the Everglades, definitely. You have this natural experiment in one piece of wetland they call the Water Conservation Area 2. In the northern part of it, receiving the agricultural runoff, and you go down there, the northern part of the WCA2 is totally different from the southern part. The northern part of it is all densely populated with cattail. And you move away from there, you see the native sawgrass and the prairie, sort of, they call that sloughs. Yeah. So definitely changing the nutrient dynamic will change the plant community.
Yeah. And that was one of the big concerns of our practitioners is if we're changing the plant community, then we're probably going to change the habitat availability for birds and fish and other organisms.
That's right.
So
that is actually what the Olentangy wetland was set up to study.
So some good next steps then for research and for management. Well, this might be a good question. Yeah, really good questions from everybody. So we'll definitely keep a record of these. This is probably a good point, I think, to pass it back to Nick to wrap us up. And big thank you to everybody who stayed on the line for the whole time.
Yeah, big thank you for staying with us here as we answer all your questions. A couple quick announcements for upcoming webinars. Next week, actually, on Tuesday, we have our next panel webinar on blue carbon. The panelists and moderator are listed here on the slide. So the purpose of that webinar will be 4 regions across the United States will share lessons learned from their work leading blue carbon projects and offer ideas for advancing the use of blue carbon for coastal wetland management. And then looking ahead to next month, we have a webinar featuring 2 speakers from the Elkhorn Slough Reserve in California about restoring native oysters along North America's west coast. So please be on the lookout for those and future announcements. And we'll just wrap with a big thank you to our speakers again for being with us today and for sharing the resources and their great work with us. And thank you all for sticking around again for questions. Be on the lookout for the webinar brief and the session recording. Session recording should be available in the next couple of days. The webinar brief will be available in the next few weeks and will contain a record of the Q&A. So again, thank you to our speakers, and everyone have a great day.